Hello, welcome to day 2 of the Past Data Community Summit of 2021. I'm Bob Ward from Microsoft. Wow, the excitement from yesterday was pretty amazing that I saw, personally witnessed, and I've seen on social media about the keynote we did at the past summit and about the announcement of SQL Server 2022 and the session we did yesterday to tell you all the capabilities in the next release of SQL Server. Before I get started with today's session, I just want to say a special thanks. Today is Veterans Day in the United States of America, and I want to say thank you to all the veterans that are watching today or anyone watching that has family or friends that are veterans. Thank you. Thank you for the dedication, the sacrifice, and especially thank you for your service. So today we're going to talk about a little deeper discussion than what something I presented yesterday about how SQL Server is connected to the cloud. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a few logistics about today's session. It's so exciting to be here live, but you're going to have some questions. Behind the scenes, I have experts from Microsoft that actually own some of the technologies we're talking about today, so they're the perfect people to be here. Minay Tokas, who's a PM leader in Microsoft, our organization that owns the Synapse Link feature. I've worked with Minay for a while. She's an amazing, super nice person, and she's excited to hear what questions you have so she can know how are we going to make sure this is a great experience for you? Dr. Danny Lepeva from our Serbia team owns the Managed Instance Leak feature for disaster recovery. Danny is also behind the scenes here answering your questions, and he is especially excited to hear what you have to say about that feature. Now, a couple fun things about Danny. Notice I said doctor. I didn't know he was a doctor. He has a PhD, and did you know he just completed the Boston Marathon? Danny's an amazing individual. Can't wait to show off his technology today and for you to give feedback to Danny. And then also, maybe you heard a guy named Joe Sack. Yeah, Joe, he is the overlord of the SQL Server release. So Joe is behind the scenes because he also wants to hear what you have to say about this. Now, also, you're like, Bob, I need the deck. I always want the deck. Where's the deck? That's what you're going to put in the Q&A window. Where's the deck? It's right there. aka.ms, Bob Ward MS. This deck right here that I'm showing you today is already up there available to you so you can download, follow along, or look at it after the fact. Okay, let's get started with today's topic and what we mean about hybrid data platform. So this is Bob's definition. This is not some official definition I looked up on the internet from some research firm. This is Bob's definition of a hybrid data platform. And this is based on my experience over the years working with Microsoft and our SQL technologies. So there's two aspects I've seen when people talk about the word hybrid, and that is a product or service offered both on premises and in the cloud with consistency. That's a key point here, right? And if you think about SQL, I think we kind of meet that criteria of being hybrid. So in one way, you show up in both on premises and the cloud with a product that has consistency. Now, a more interesting way of looking at hybrid is connection. So can you have a product that's on premise that can connect to the cloud? And notice the key point here, to do enhancements. Like, you don't want to just connect for no reason. Give me some capabilities that I need from a data perspective that'll make me more effective. So with that context in mind, why don't you consider this? Consider about, has SQL Server been hybrid? Well, from those two criteria that, again, it's Bob's definition of a hybrid data platform, I think that's the case. Maybe not as rich as you hope, though. But first of all, of course, this is our Azure SQL family, SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Managed Instance, and Azure SQL Database. We've been talking a lot about these technologies this week and over the last year or so. You've seen me out there talking a lot about these technologies. And these are technologies that are based on SQL Server that run in Azure. But what about that connection part? What about, is SQL ever connected to the cloud? Well, this may not seem daunting or amazing to you, but let's make sure we review what we've done. And the reason I'm going to do that is that you're going to see how we're going to build on what we've done. So number one, we've had this for years, right? You've been able to take SQL Server on premises, and you've been able to back up to Azure Blob Storage. You can even do that in Azure Virtual Machine, and a lot of people do that when they move into the cloud. You can even do that in Azure SQL Managed Instance. But we've had this tried and true, very popular actually feature to take backups and say, look, I'd like Azure Storage to be kind of a DR site for me, and I'd like to put my backups in the cloud. Now, how else have we connected? Well, two other ways. One is in the middle here, some customers have chosen, and you may not know this is even possible, to take an Azure SQL Managed Instance, a SQL Server and Azure VM, or even an Azure SQL Database, and make that a subscriber to a transaction replication system running in your on-premises environment. Or maybe link servers. Maybe you set up one of these SQL servers to be a link server to your on-premises environment. Now, the other interesting one, though, is always on availability groups. We've had customers use Azure SQL Server and Azure Virtual Machine to be a replica from SQL Server on premises. And in fact, we announced in SQL 19 that SQL Server and Azure VM could be a licensed free SQL DR site for you with an async system set up between SQL Server and the cloud. So those are just some fundamental things we've done over the years for SQL Server to make it hybrid. Both the Azure SQL family, which is, again, our product that shows up both on premises and in the cloud in a consistent way, and a way to take SQL Server and connect it into cloud services. But it's our intention to go farther with SQL Server 2022. Now, before I talk about that, you may have heard of a product called Azure Arc. Now, specifically, Azure Arc enabled data services are really platform as a service, like managed instance capability connecting to the cloud. But this is more from a SQL Server perspective. We have something called SQL Server and Azure Arc enabled servers. We've announced that this summer to be available to you. And the concept is this. You could take your existing SQL Server and using something called Azure Arc Agent, you can view and organize your SQL Server on premises with other Azure SQL services. So wouldn't you like to be able to go in the cloud in a portal, for example, and see your SQL Server along with your other Azure SQL assets, like I just showed you on the previous screen, with managed instance, VMs, and databases. Not only that, we've added a couple additional capabilities. And again, remember, we're talking about existing SQL servers, SQL 17, 19, 16, running both either on Windows or Linux. We have something called SQL Assessment, using something called Azure Log Analytics for best practices. So if you'll connect your SQL Server using Azure Arc to Azure, we can apply what we have called SQL assessments in the cloud to look at and apply best practices for you and give you recommendations based on known best practices across Microsoft knowledge. And then you might have heard of Microsoft Defender for the cloud. It used to be called Azure Defender. There's a Microsoft Defender SQL as part of the suite of that functionality that can be used for security assessments. And we're going to see later on in this presentation a little bit more information about what does that mean for SQL Server 2022. So Azure Arc enabled servers with SQL Server is kind of the next evolution of that hybrid story I just showed you that we've had around for a while. So based on that, what is SQL Server 2022 really doing in this space? How is it a hybrid data platform? Well, it's still part of the family of Azure SQL, so the consistency of what we're doing in the engine applies in Azure SQL. Functionality that you've seen already that we talked about yesterday, like intelligent query performance, are also in the cloud, so the consistency part is there. But what about the connected part? And if you look here, let me get my little laser, my little laser. I love this little laser pointer in PowerPoint. If you look at this diagram right here, these are the three areas we mentioned yesterday, which are giving us functionality to connect you between a SQL Server 2022 instance and Azure. So it's my intention for the rest of this presentation to kind of focus on these three areas and actually a couple of more that we did not talk about yesterday. So let's do that. And let's do some demonstrations along the way. Now I'm going to be transparent. The demonstrations I have are embedded in my deck and they're recordings that I've done, but I'll pause along the way inside the recording to kind of show and highlight a few things. Some of you may have already seen, you've seen the managed instance functionality demonstrated by Anna Hoffman. We'll use that same type of demo, but we'll pause and talk a little bit more about what we're doing behind the scenes. We have a demo for Synapse Link that I think you'll really, really like. We're using a recording there, but we'll also kind of pause and talk about what we're doing. And then we have a demo for Azure Purview. My great colleague, Andres Volter, who has demonstrated this, he's allowed me to use his demo to talk a little bit about what we're doing in that space. And if we have time, we'll look a little bit at Microsoft Defender as well. Okay, that in mind, this is Bob's, if you remember this yesterday, I don't know if you've seen this, I always call this my camera slide. I had one in SQL 19 that looked a little different than this. This is the view of SQL Server 2022 at major categories of what we're doing. Not all the details, but the categories. And you see here, cloud connected, and even data virtualization could be considered ways to attach SQL Server to the cloud. So we are going to talk about this space today. We're not going to cover much on this space today. I talked about a little bit yesterday, but consider the fact that data virtualization could be you connecting to, say, like an S3 compatible storage facility somewhere in the cloud. And of course, everything we're talking about is based on our engine, which we talked about yesterday, our capabilities for built-in query intelligence, our investment in the meat and potatoes, and extending new T-SQL scenarios. If you want to learn more about those areas, go back and look at the on-demand recording of the session we did yesterday for SQL Server 2022. And then you also can take a look at Pedro Lope's session yesterday that he did on this space. And then tomorrow, my colleague David Pless will dive more into this security space as well. So with that said, what does a picture look like for all the cloud connected capabilities of SQL Server 2022? Well, this again is Bob's view of the world. So look at our little boundary. I'm going to use the little dashed boundary a lot today to talk about SQL Server connecting into the cloud in Azure. But keep this in mind. Whenever you see this little boundary here, it could be that SQL Server and Azure virtual machine running up in Azure could actually have some of those capabilities. Okay, so let's first look at Azure SQL Managed Instance. And the idea being here, and notice the two-way arrow here, is that a SQL Server can now talk to Azure SQL Managed Instance, a deployed managed instance, and it can replicate data, like using an availability group and even participate as a failover partner. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then in Synapse Link, you notice this is more of a one-way feed, and that is us sending data changes, like feeds from SQL Server into Synapse to help give you analytics. We'll talk about that as well. And then we talked about Purview yesterday, and this is a two-way street. And the reason why is this: Purview, even today for existing SQL servers, can analyze and scan your SQL for schema, and eventually at some point looking at things like lineage to kind of give you visibility into your data state of what's going on in SQL. But you can do that across a lot of SQL resources. What's going to be new for SQL Server 2022 is the policy management piece. So we'll dive in a little bit what that's going to look like. Now, there are two things we did not talk about yesterday, and we'll talk a little bit about those today, and that is, first of all, authentication. So it's our intention to allow Azure Active Directory to now be an authentication system for SQL Server 2022. That is going to be extremely popular if you're running an Azure SQL virtual machine, because now you can get non-SQL auth into the cloud without having a domain. And you're going to take advantage of some of the features that Azure AD gives you, things like multi-factor authentication. And then finally, I did mention Microsoft Defender for SQL, where you can get proactive assessments and even alerts to your security. So step back for a second and just look at this. This is the SQL Server 22 cloud connected family of features. And let's go and look at some of these. We'll spend sometimes more on others, sometimes less, but we'll talk about each one of these. So first of all, I like to kind of view things from a challenge and solution perspective. And I think you saw that yesterday. We had this very slide up to talk about that. So let me summarize that again for you, make a couple things more clear. Let me show you a little deeper behind the scenes of what we're doing in this space. And then we'll do a demonstration of what it actually looks like. Okay, so what is difficult about DR? Everything. You always need it though, right, for production systems. So it's difficult to set up to maintain. I showed you how even Azure Virtual Machine could be used almost in a way as a DR site for a SQL Server, but that could be hard to do and set up and maintain. So it's our intention for Azure SQL Managed Instance to make this a lot easier. So remember, Azure SQL Managed Instance is platform as a service. So what we'd like to do is allow you to take your SQL Server 2022 instance, connect it to a deployed Azure SQL Managed Instance, and make that now a failover partner. We would then take changes from SQL Server, replicate them into Managed Instance, and then if you needed to, you could fail over. And it's also our intention before we release SQL Server, by the time we release the final version of the product, even though we're not demonstrating that today, that you could fail back. What we did demonstrate is the ability to restore a database from Managed Instance back to SQL Server. It's the first time we've shown the ability to connect these two systems, a platform as a service and a SQL Server, in this fashion. Now, you could optionally use the Managed Instance for read purposes while you're doing this replication system, because it is a read-only database at that point. And we're going to use distributed availability group technology behind the scenes to kind of make this work. So far, when I've presented this yesterday and we announced these things last week, I've seen a lot of customers get excited about the fact that now it could be easier to set up a DR site, and it could be a managed service now to make that happen. Now, we understand that this is a lot of pieces to put together. So it's our intention to make this as seamless as possible, as easy as possible, configure it, and even help you troubleshoot problems with this in the best way we can. So let's look a little bit more about what does it mean to be distributed availability group technology and how we're putting that into this feature. You may or may not know about this technology. Maybe you do. In SQL Server 2016, we introduced the concept of a distributed availability group. Now, if you look at this picture here, this is right from the documentation. You may have what I call an AG, I'm just going to use that term, AG, on one of your systems here, with a primary and a secondary. And what you'd like to do is set up another AG, typically not co-located near here, maybe somewhere geographically different. And you'd like to tie these together. You'd like to take changes from this AG and typically asynchronous. You could do it sync, but typically asynchronous. You'd like to push those changes into the other AG. So that if you had to, you could fail over to this AG and that could become your new primary system. Now, the neat thing about the technology is this, it's built into SQL Server. So this is all within the engine to make that arrow happen. The idea of a distributed AG is that the SQL Server engine has all the technology needed to make this communication occur, make the failover occur, all those decisions. It's not an auto failover technology, which is one of the reasons why it's all built into SQL. And kind of what happens here is that the primary updates the local secondary and the remote primary as part of its operation. Now here's the rub. It's not easy to set up. It's not easy to configure. It's not easy to maintain. And so that's been kind of a little bit of the blemish for this, is that people have said, this is pretty cool technology, but this is hard. And it's a little time, it's expensive and kind of time consuming to do all of this. So with that in mind, what are we doing for this new link feature for Azure SQL Managed Instance? Well, it looks something like this. And I just want to point out here, I told you Danny is behind the scenes online. Danny is lurking behind the scenes, answering your questions, excited to see what you have to say about this. But I want to point out to you that if you're going away from this session and you want to know a lot more about what we're doing, I've got a link here that Danny gave me about a blog post he wrote to talk a lot more about this technology. Let me also distinguish in his blog post one thing here, because there's been some questions about this. The link feature for Azure SQL Managed Instance covers really kind of two areas right now, but we're all in just preview starting with, right? Number one, for previous versions of SQL Server, this is a nice idea and capability to give you read scale and migration. For SQL Server 2022, it's our intention to make this more of the disaster recovery or failover feature. Now, if you look at this diagram here, it kind of gives you an idea what's going on. So your primary replica in SQL Server is in an availability group. It's going to use a link to actually, using DAG technologies or DAG, to replicate to the secondary, which is also now an availability group. And you're like, well, this is interesting. Do I have to do all of this stuff? You just said it was hard to do that. Well, consider this. Consider that if you have an AG already in your environment, it's our intention to just use that and connect this to an AG in Managed Instance. If you don't, we build one for you. So if you just have a database sitting over here in your SQL Server and you go through the process of setting this up, we're just going to build an availability group and build the DAG for you to connect it to Managed Instance. And because it's Managed Instance that you would have deployed, we know how to make that happen behind the scenes on the Managed Instance side. And it is also our intention that everything comes with SQL Server and Managed Instance. Now, it is true that you're going to have to deploy the Managed Instance and install SQL Server, and we're going to give you guidance on how you do that. But once you do that, it's our intention that everything comes with these products to just make this link and connection work. And in fact, you're going to see in the demonstration in a second, it's integrated with Management Studio. Now, you're going to see maybe some preview screens of what that integration looks like, but using like wizard type technologies to actually make this connection and link happen all together. We mentioned already that you could restore back to SQL Server 2022 for like dev test purposes from Managed Instance once you make this link occur. Now, if you look at this diagram right here, one thing to point out is that it's possible that this over here could be an Azure virtual machine. So literally the SQL could be inside this part of Azure if you wanted to and still make this link successful. That could be an interesting scenario for you if that's what you wanted to do. If you wanted your Azure VM for SQL Server to have a DR site in the cloud and you want it managed, Managed Instance could be that for you. But of course, many customers are looking to do this because their SQL Server is on premises. Now, again, one of the advantages here is the fact that the DR site is fully managed. And you may be asking yourself, like, what does that even mean? Well, consider the Azure virtual machine scenario I talked about earlier, where SQL Server is connected to a SQL Server in Azure VM. It is true that the infrastructure in Azure is managed by Microsoft, but you manage the SQL inside the VM. You manage the operating system. You manage the updates. You do all that stuff, but for Azure Managed Instance, that's abstracted from you. In fact, consider this. There's built-in redundancies for everything we do in a Managed Instance in a virtual cluster. The data, the log files, the backups, all redundant, all either geo-redundant, local, or zone redundant. There's built-in high availability. This doesn't even have to be a business critical service tier to make this work. So already naturally, you now have built-in HA and redundancy, and guess what? All the backups are kicking in as well. So automatic backups are happening behind the scenes in this Managed Instance. And then we're also applying automatic updates. So anytime we need to patch or make a change for you to keep things up to date, we do that for you. And if you're worried about security, this can exist in a private virtual network. So you could, for example, when you set up this feature, you could take your SQL Server, put that in a network, and then you could actually tie that to a virtual network in Azure and make this a very secured private connection. So this is a very lucrative idea for some customers to think about. I'm thinking in terms of that you are thinking today, you need a DR site, you're managing it, it's very expensive to do. I'd like a better solution. We think this might be it. Let's go look at it in the form of a demonstration. And I'm going to use the demo that Anna Hoffman has showed you a little bit, but we'll pause and stop and talk about what's happening a little bit behind the scenes. So, and you see here, I may pause this recording to do that. And you see what happened here. Anna, I'll just pause right now to show you. Anna had set up here a SQL server in Management Studio. She's on the SQL server itself, and she's connected down here in SSMS to Managed Instance. So think about her being in a virtual machine with the SQL Server 2022 instance, connected locally to it, but also connected remotely to Managed Instance so you can visibly see what's going on. And the idea being is that we have a wide role importers database example that you've seen before, but she's added in a table for like an email campaign. So what we're going to see is, can we synchronize that new table? First of all, is the database synchronized? Can we synchronize that? And then can we look at our email campaign? So this is the local SQL instance. Now somebody pointed out to me on the internet, hey, what's this SQL vNext thing? That's just the name of the instance on SQL Server. We always code name things a lot of times SQL vNext, but that's not like a version name here. That's just the name of the instance. But you can see here that the instance is read-write, and this is the new table she has in her local SQL Server. So let's keep going and look at a little what's going to happen here. She's just showing you and kind of setting up for you. I've got the primary that I'm writing to. So what she's going to do is use, this is SSMS. Now, this is the integration that we talked about. I'm not suggesting, and I'm not going to tell you that this might be the final names that we have here. Maybe this changes slightly a little bit. This is the preview experience. What we're trying to show you is that we're integrating with SSMS, a tool you know and love, this experience to attach it or configure it and eventually to fail over to it, or in this case, it says the word migrate. Okay, so let's keep going and see what it's going to look like. So this attach experience, she does not show you the full experience, right? She just shows you the fact that you can attach it. So let me pause for a second. So what happens there? What did she not show you? What she did not show you was a series of screens where you put in your Azure subscription, you pick the managed instance that you've deployed, and then you have a few options on how you're going to synchronize these together. And it's really a few simple set of screens. So the attaching part is, again, just telling us in Azure, where do you want to go? What do you want to do with this? So once you do that attachment now, that part of it is to synchronize this database into Managed Instance. And so let's keep going and see what it looks like. So, but notice here, let's pause again here. Now why is she showing you that? That's because wide role importers did not have an availability group on this SQL Server to start with. And by doing the attach operation, we synchronized the data in Managed Instance, and then we did that built-in distributed availability group I mentioned to you. It didn't have one. We built one behind the scenes for this. You should also know that everything we do in SQL Server has T-SQL equivalents. So it'll be our intention that not only will you have this experience here, but you'd have T-SQL syntax to go settle this up yourself as well. Okay, let's keep going. So you've got this built-in AG, right? Distributed AG, connected to Managed Instance. And so if you go further and see what she's going to show, we want to see like, hey, what does it look like in Managed Instance? So this is the Managed Instance that's been deployed. Now in this case, we're using a business critical service tier. It doesn't have to be that. So we deploy this Managed Instance ahead of time, not as part of that experience. And we're now going to see, does the database actually show up there that we attached, which is wide role importers. So we're going to go back to Management Studio here. And when we go back and take a look at it, we're going to see, hey, is that database there? So this is why we connected over here into SSMS on the same screen to show it to you. And there is that database. But what you expect to have happen, and this is the split screen view of the world, is that this should be read-only. It should have my email campaign, but it shouldn't be the fact that I can write to it. Now you've seen we've got the setup. We've got the primary, we've got the secondary in a read-only fashion. So what if we make a change? So in this scenario, what Anna demonstrated is I'm going to insert a row, just a simple demonstration of change, a change feed, because it's an availability group. I got a new row here. I should be able to quickly run a query and see the new row. Makes sense, right? If you had an AG scenario, you'd have this same setup. But remember, this is also the case if you did a distributed AG. If you had an AG here and you made a change, you had a distributed AG, that change would be pushed into the new other one in the remote. And that's what we're actually doing in this case. Okay, let's keep going further and seeing what she has to show for us. So now that you've got that set up, it could be that you say, okay, there's a problem I'm having on my primary. I'd like to fail over to the secondary. Now this screen says migrate, but this is the same experience to show you that I want to fail over to this managed instance. And you're going to see some screens here where we talk about how you can be synchronized, because this is an async operation at this point. So this is a wizard to do the actual migrate or failover. Signing into Azure, she kind of shows you this experience. She's going to pick her account. And again, remember, this can be automated. This is showing you like a wizard experience. Now what she's doing is she's logging into that MI. She deployed an MI, so she's giving you the credentials for that. And then notice here this word, and this is the same technology, or excuse me, the same terminology we use today with AGs, a planned manual failover or a forced failover. Now, why is planned that word? It's because you're going to quiesce your application and you're going to say, I'd like to synchronize now as much as I can before I do this, versus just forcing it and potentially having some data loss. So let's go to the planned part of this demo. You hit planned, and then you go through a wizard to say, look, I'm doing this necessary steps to synchronize this. And you know what we're doing at this point, right? We're just pushing over the necessary rest of the log changes based on LSNs to make sure that everything is going. Now, let me pause here to make sure you understand these warnings. It's like and again, this is a preview experience, but this is like a 3-attempt scenario. And the first attempt worked. So we have 3 chances to try to go synchronize the primary to the replica in this particular case. But the first one worked, so we're going to move forward. It doesn't mean it's the final experience, but I'm just going to give you an idea of what we're doing. So now what she's trying to show you is, I'm in the managed instance over here. I'd like to go insert a row into that managed instance because it's now the read-write. It's now the new primary. So insert a row over here, show you that in fact, this is now the read-write replica. And then now what I'd like to do maybe is do a backup of managed instance, but we said you could actually do a backup. So why not do a backup of managed instance with this new change and restore this back to SQL Server 2022 to see what that change looks like. So as you see here, now notice here, she's doing a backup to URL. We mentioned that technology is a hybrid technology. You may not have known that with managed instance. You can do a copy-only backup we have the automated backups, but you can do your own copy-only backup if you want to Azure Storage. And so then you could go to the SQL Server side on premises, and you could do a restore from that same Azure Storage account, and you would hope to see the new row show up there, right? So let's go back over here, and she's going to show you on the local SQL Server the restore syntax. Here's the restore syntax. Restore the database, restore it from that same location in Azure Storage, and then let's go do a query to make sure that showed up. Now, this would be like a dev test scenario. I want to go see the data on what I just changed in managed instance. She called it a new name just to avoid it from the original one. But let's make one thing clear here. It's our intention as we go through the preview and finally release SQL Server 2022, that's not your fail back scenario. That's just a way to back up and restore, that you would have an experience where once you're in managed instance and you're ready for your SQL Server to get synchronized back, you could fail back to SQL Server as a true failover partner would look like. So that is a view of the link feature of managed instance. I know Danny is excited to see people sign up for this and give us your feedback on the experience. Okay, let's move forward now. And we talked about DR. If you think about my little wheel, I talked about DR for managed instance. The second part of that wheel was analytics. Now, today, it could be that you have a system with your customer, or you consult with a customer, or you're in a company where SQL Server exists in one world and analytics exists in a different world. Or it could be that today you try to do analytics on SQL Server and operational data on SQL Server. So for both those worlds, there's some pain points. Number one, trying to do analytics on SQL Server, even though we have some great technologies, column store indexes and so forth, sometimes can cause resource problems on the operational data, the SQL Server and the workload. So you're trying to find a way to separate these worlds. If you separate these worlds, what do? You got to copy things typically, or you got to build very expensive ETL systems, maybe even use things like ADF or SSIS, to make this an experience where you have your operational data in SQL Server, and then on Synapse, which is a great system for analytics, you want to see those changes. But usually when you do that, you're always struggling to get data that's out of date. So what we're going to do now for SQL Server 2022, and here's that word link again, we're going to link or connect SQL Server with Synapse to give you what we hope you perceive as near real-time analytics. Now, how's this going to work? So you got a SQL Server on premises, And in Synapse that you've deployed, you have something called a workspace. If you've not used Synapse before, everything is about a Synapse workspace. And inside that workspace is something called a SQL pool. Think of this as your dedicated SQL tables. Remember, this used to be called Azure Data Warehouse? These are the tables for the warehouse. So unlike Cosmos DB Link, which is great technology, we're going to feed our changes into SQL pools to give you the full warehouse scalability power of Synapse. So what's going to happen here, we're going to show you a diagram in a second of kind of the pieces that make this work. We're going to take changes from a SQL server once we've synchronized and feed those into these SQL pools directly, allowing you to use things like Power BI, machine learning, and even Spark to get near real-time analytics. So today, you're copying into maybe daily into Synapse. You refresh your Power BI report daily, but somebody's like, that's not good enough for my business. I want to do this like now. And so think about the fact that once you're in Synapse, not only could do that kind of type of reporting on analytics, what if you had like IoT data feeding into Azure Data Lake storage? Because this is Synapse. You have all these type of different places you can put data. Now, before, it would take me a day to go combine IoT data. IoT data is never usually that stale. I've got all these IoT data feeding into my Azure Data Lake storage. Now I've got near real-time changes with SQL. I can do near real-time analytics on both those data sets now using Power BI, using machine learning, and even using Spark, or just using SQL queries on top of Synapse. Pretty excited to see this technology land. And just to make sure we're clear about this, we are using SQL pools. So you get the full power of scalability and things that from a full warehouse solution that Synapse provides. Cosmos DB Link is a great technology, but it doesn't give you quite that same thing because the data is not in the SQL pools. It's in a columnar store with Cosmos DB. So with that in mind, I work with Monet offline a little bit on this, and we want to show you a preview of our architecture. Now, again, you're going to look at this and go, Bob, this is way too many pieces here. How are you going to make this work? It's our intention, again, as we work you through the previews, and we work the public preview, as we work to the release, to make all these pieces as seamless as possible as we can for you. It is a lot of moving pieces to make this technology work, though. Let's talk about it. Here's my cloud line here on the left-hand side. And you see here on premises, this is SQL Server 2022 with a transaction log and a database. And there's a piece of software called the Self-Hosted Integration Runtime. It's a piece of software that's installed on your on-premises machine. And in this environment, with a predefined that you've built Synapse workspace, we give you guidance on how to go deploy that. You would then connect your hosted runtime with Azure Data Factory that's inside the workspace. Now, you don't have to set that up. That's set up for you as part of linking this together. So those two pieces of software are required to talk to each other on premises and in the cloud. On the SQL Server side, what we're going to do is we're going to help you set up something called a buffer area, which is Azure Storage. Azure Storage is not in the workspace, but it is kind of a landing zone for us to go take data that you have in SQL Server table format and put it in a format that something called an ingestion engine knows how to understand. That ingestion engine can see for changes that are happening in this buffer area and put them into the SQL pools, which again give you the full power and scalability of Synapse. So from a high level picture here, you can see the pieces working together. I got SQL servers, I got Azure storage, I got a Synapse workspace, I've got an integrated runtime, I got Azure Data Factory. A lot of stuff. Again, our intention is to make this very seamless, but we wanted you to see behind the scenes what kind of technology is powering this. So keep these things in mind about how this experience is going to look for you. Number one, there's going to be like an initial export of data. You need to get tables that you've chosen in your database, and you have to decide which tables those are to synchronize or seed or export those into Synapse. And what we're going to do is kind of create a snapshot experience, but we want to make sure that we don't block users when we do that. So we're going to do as lightweight as blocking as possible to make that experience happen. Now, once that is done, we're going to harvest the transaction log. It's not replication. It's not change data capture. It's not availability groups. We have a different technology for getting change feeds from your log in transactionally consistent batches, put those in the buffer area, and have the ingestion engine feed those into SQL pools. Now, that buffer area, it's an asynchronous operation. We will not hold up your transactions to make this happen, which is why we're making the contention point here that this is near real time, and we're avoiding conflicting with your operational workloads in SQL Server. But we're going to do some things to make this expedient. We're going to do polling intervals that you can configure, and we're going to use things like parallelism of workers to make this process as fast as possible into your Synapse workspace. So that's a little look at the Synapse Link architecture. You know, I promised Monet I would say it's a preview architecture subject to change, because this is kind of how we're thinking about this is going to work right now in our initial release. But again, that's why we do previews. We want to work with you directly to see, are these the right pieces to make this work? But be assured of this. There's going to be a SQL server. We're going to use log changes. You're going to use SQL pools. And then we need these other pieces behind the scenes like Azure Data Factory, the runtime, and the engine and the buffer to make all this happen. So the components will all be part of this architecture. How we tie them together, how we set it up for you, how we configure it for you, that's the part we need to go work with you hard on during the release to make it successful. All right, let's see what it looks like based on a demonstration. Now, this is a demonstration you have not seen so far at PASS probably, and this is Synapse Link for SQL Server. Okay, let's also pause and look at this scenario. So first of all, I'm in Synapse Studio. Maybe you've not seen this before. And I have gone through, and you can see right down here, I have linked my SQL Server right here, SQL 2022, with an existing database in SQL pools in Synapse. By making this connection happen, what I've done is remember the snapshot we talked about? I've created a snapshot of two tables. Now imagine wide world importers, our little example we use all the time. We have two new tables that we've added in SQL Server. We've added a vehicle table that's going to be tracking location of our vehicles. And we've got cargo tracking. So our vehicle stock items are like, what vehicles have what cargo and how much they have. So even though over here, most of my wild world imported database was in my warehouse, I usually use copy operations to make that possible. But what I'd like to do now is take this new vehicle and stock item data and make only the changes show up in here so that I get near real-time analytics on this vehicle information. So the way I've done that is I've set up this link inside Synapse Studio between my SQL Server and my SQL pools. And I've already synchronized these two tables in the database, so they should show up. So again, I'm showing you the process that we made happen to make this synchronization happen. And here are the tables that I've synchronized. These are tables that exist in my SQL Server 2022 Wide World Importers database. I'm showing you the other tables here, also in the SQL pools, that were previously copied from the SQL Server 2022 system. But now since I'm synchronized, you can see these over here. And just to prove that I've got the data, you can see already now what kind of information is going to show up in the vehicle registration. Registration information about like what's the vehicle registration ID, what type it is. Oh, they're all in Texas. What a surprise. Who created this demo? And then the cities are all in Texas. So I want to track eventually here in a Power BI report, where are my vehicles in my system? So with that in mind, now that I know this, here's my Power BI report. So this is a graphical look of the vehicles and their cargo. Now, just to show you here, these are cities in Texas that many of you have heard of and known. And the size of the circle, maybe you're a Power BI guru. I'm not, but I got the basics down. I think Adam and Patrick always help me on all these Power BI questions. They're just amazing, right? The size of these circles is the size of the cargo. So this looks kind of the same, like every vehicle seems to have almost the same size of cargo. I want to do some basic near real-time tracking to see what that size looks like over time. But before I could only do it like once a day. I want to see it a little more closer than that. So that's my report I'm running in Synapse. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to connect to my SQL Server. Oh, I'm running SQL Server 2022. There's the version right there. And in my database, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new vehicle. In my system that I'm doing for vehicle tracking, I'm going to add a vehicle for Dallas with its registration information. I'm going to add some cargo for it. And I'm going to expand the amount of cargo I have for my vehicle in Waco. Now, what I'd like to do is to go into Synapse with these changes I've made and see near real-time changes. So first of all, let's run a query and see that. You can see now by running this query again, Dallas is going to show up. Remember, I had that new vehicle. That's pretty near real time, right? And in addition, I want to see Waco show the bigger cargo, but I'll do it through the report. So you can see here now by refreshing this report, the new Dallas truck has shown up. And then the Waco cargo by the bigger circle has shown that I've got more cargo in that truck. So this is about as near real time as it gets. Just a refresh of the report, and data ahead of my SQL Server now exists in Synapse. Now, once you're in Synapse, there are some interesting scenarios, not specifically related to the Synapse link, but it makes it now possible. Because I have those incremental changes inside Synapse, I can do some amazing things. And Spark and machine learning are two of those things. So I could go and take those incremental changes along with IoT data that's being fed in from sensors for my vehicles, like for engine temperatures, and I can combine this now together and do predictive maintenance machine learning with this. So Anna Hoffman, my just wonderful, amazing colleague, built this model for me on top of my data, because I don't know what this stuff looks like. She does, Buck Woody does, but I'm not a data scientist. Maybe I play one on TV. But I was like, hey guys, can you build a machine learning model based on what I said? And they're like, yeah, we can, because we got Spark and we have IoT data in our data lake. So this is a machine learning model using Spark in Synapse, doing some predictive maintenance for me. So this is showing like overall the vehicles we talked about and their registration, because the registration from IoT links this data together. And then below, we can actually look at vehicle temperatures to do what we call like anomaly detections. This is really powerful to me, because now think about this. I've got my analytic folks that know analytics with Power BI looking at near real-time changes in my vehicles. My data scientists are using Synapse to do machine learning training of machine learning models. Now imagine a world where I could take this model, push it to Azure SQL Edge into the truck, and do predictive maintenance in the truck. But Synapse and SQL Server gave me the possibility to make that all possible. Okay, that's Synapse Link for SQL Server 2022. So disaster recovery and analytics, those are two big features of what we're doing. What about security? And we talked about before three areas. We talked about Azure Active Directory, we talked about Purview and Defender. Let's talk about Purview first. And I think the challenge that I've heard when people think of this Purview technology is getting everything centralized. I need visibility in a central way, and I need to do governance or like policy management in a central place. So Purview, when it released, already had the visibility part. And what do we mean by that? Well, it has the ability to scan your existing SQL servers to get metadata like tables and columns and types and so forth from your SQL server. In addition, it had the ability to do classification for that metadata. Now, let's be clear on this. We have a data classification system in SQL Server and Azure SQL today. It's kind of our intention to steer and enhance that functionality to light it up across all of SQL. So again, think of Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, virtual machine, SQL Server on premises. I'd like that visibility across all this in one place. Purview can give you that. What's new and what we've announced, and you've seen Andreas probably talk about it this week, is doing access rights to SQL Server from Purview. So let's take a little bit of a different look, deeper, of what do we mean by this access right concept. And this is, you know, I love working with my colleagues, because Danny gave me the slides on Managed Instance. Thank you, Danny. Monet gave me the slides on Synapse. I worked with both of them to kind of polish it and tweak it. And then Andreas gave me the slide about policy management, and I kind of tweaked it a little bit as well. But I've got the same concept that they've all been, you know, if you look at each one, each of them talk about these areas the same way. I'm just presenting it to you sometimes in a different fashion. So you're in Azure, you got this Purview concept, you got Azure Active Directory, and your goal, if you look at the right-hand side here, is to publish a policy for performance monitoring access rights to SQL Server and Azure VM, to Managed Instance and Azure SQL Database. And since you're in Azure, and now we're going to do Azure Active Directory authentication for VMs, you can do all this. In fact, consider this scenario. You would like to establish a performance monitor role in your organization. You have several people that do that. You want to create this in a way that they only have the rights they need to do this operation. You want to publish this across all your SQL estate. You don't want to have to connect into every one of these things, especially with a bunch of databases, and have to go set this up yourself. Couldn't Purview handle that for me? And because that it can, and that's the whole intention, we now have SQL Server 2022. Remember, that's that cloud line in this space. So now it gets interesting. Remember we talked about the whole hybrid idea of being consistent across all of our SQLs? Well, we're doing that here, but we're doing it in a way that we're connecting a SQL Server to Azure and using Purview to make that possible. So with that in mind, let me shamelessly use Andreas's demo and pause through it and show you what it looks like. Now, Andreas set this up. You're going to see his name show up in here. And what you're looking at now is something called Purview Studio. Just like Synapse Studio, Purview has a studio. It's browser-based. It's going to allow you to manage things in the Purview space for visibility, cataloging, and even policies. So let's go further and see. And the intention of what Andre is going to show you is this. He's going to show up these roles he set up with Azure Active Directory accounts. He's going to connect into an Azure SQL database. In this case, we're going to use that as part of our demonstration. It's going to be the same experience for SQL Server to see it. He's want to establish these policies in Azure SQL database without actually connecting to that and running the policies there. So let's do it, see what it looks like. So there's a concept called map, which you go in, shows you kind of a visual way of these policies. And you see below here, the policies are going to be for Azure SQL database. And as you drill into this map and look at these policies, you're going to be able to go into policy management and see what Andre has set up. He's got two different roles: performance monitoring and security auditing. And if you go in here, there's a very visual way to see what these look like. So for example, for auditing, Andreas has added himself as an Azure Active Directory user to the auditing role. So now he could publish this policy to a bunch of Azure SQL assets to do things like auditing without having to be a sysadmin. He can just do it from here. And you see the word allow. So it's kind of a visual way to set up these policies to a very specific user. And he's going to show some more details here about what that actually looks like. Now, the other thing that we might want to do, though, is this performance monitoring role and kind of look and see. Now, one of the things about policies you need to do is that when you build these in the system, you need to publish them. If you've ever seen Synapse, it has a publishing concept. So again, he's doing a performance monitoring. And let me pause and make sure we understand what this means. So what does performance monitoring mean? Well, we're going to help you figure that out. We're going to go use popular things like DMV queries you need to do against a SQL asset. And we're going to set up the policy so that you have rights to do those things that are considered traditionally and commonly by DBAs or IT professionals as performance monitoring. So if we establish this and publish it, then we should be able to go in those systems and do that. But what he's going to show you here is what it looks like to connect as Andreas into those systems before he's published it to see that you don't have rights to do it, and then after he's published it. So let's go see what it looks like. So with this performance monitoring in mind, let's go inside like an SSMS experience. See here, he hasn't published this yet. It would show you if he's actually published it. So let's go inside SSMS and see what this kind of whole idea actually looks like. If you connect in there, as Andreas, he's the Active Directory user. He shows he's connecting here with an integrated way with AD. Let's go through and see what it looks like kind of from a SQL perspective. Now, he has rights to connect because he had the auditing rights already. What's interesting, though, is that because he set this up in Purview, some of the queries you're going to see don't look, look at that. He is set up as a principal without actual IDs within SQL because he didn't connect into SQL to do this. He did it through Purview, and Purview is pushing down into SQL these concepts. And again, he's showing you here the fact that he's part of a public role, a database role. He's a user in the system, but it doesn't look the same as it might be if you connected into SQL Server directly. So again, we're just using common catalog views or functions that you would use to look at permissions in SQL Server. So he's connecting here and he doesn't have any permissions. And you're like, well, what's going on here? How am I going to go do stuff? And you normally see here that he's talking about the fact that some DMV queries that you would do would commonly require things like view server state permission. Is there a better way to do it? And is there a better way to do it directly? Notice here in this particular case, it shows you don't have a role-based access control action to do this. This is where we're kind of tying the Azure world with the SQL world. So now but you said, Bob, he did that performance role earlier. Why can he run this type of query? It's because he didn't publish it yet. So Purview has the concept of creating these things. Publishing is your signal to push into the Azure SQL database or into the SQL Server the access permissions that you want. And again, remember the beauty of all this is you're controlling this from a central location. So if I needed to add in Joe Sack or Danny or Monet as also being performance monitor folks, I can do that from a central spot. Imagine if Andreas was doing this across like thousands of SQLs or thousands of database, how would you do that? Now, these are other types of DMVs that we've added as part of this functionality. So you can see this is like an external policy system. You can go see how Purview is connected to SQL. One thing we like to do in SQL Server is give you insights to things that we're adding. So these are new DMVs or catalog views to do and see actually that from Purview. So with that in mind, let's go back into Purview and let's go publish this thing. Publishing, again, is an action, now that you've defined it, to go now see this in the target source. So now that it's published, you see here, we're going to push this down, in this case, into Azure SQL Database, and we're going to go see, do we have the same rights we had before, or do we have different rights? You can see now, he was a security auditor. Let's pause right there and just make sure we focus on this. Do you see right here? He used to be a security auditor. Remember, he had published that one already. That did not give him access to run those DMV queries for performance monitoring. Now he's going to be part of this new perf monitor, and notice it has the word built in. So I love when I talked to Andreas about this. We'd like to make this seamless for you. So we're going to have built-in roles for these things that are common operations for you, and work with you during the preview program to make sure we're providing you the functionality that you need as part of these built-in roles. So let's go further and see what happens. So now that he's part of this role, I'd like to go back and query the DMVs that you know and love to do performance monitoring and see if it works. And lo and behold, now I see my data. Now let's stop and explain why that worked. Again, he was a security auditor, which means specific things to do for SQL Server. He didn't create logins in SQL. He didn't create anything. He just had Purview do it for him, but that did not give him the rights to go look at DMVs for performance monitoring. Now, normally he would connect directly into this and have to apply view server state permissions, but he doesn't want to do that. In fact, if these were hundreds of databases, he would have to connect into all of these or create scripts to automate it. Now in Purview, he can establish a policy, a single policy for performance monitoring or security auditing. And with the visualization, the policy editor, he can set up all the different Azure SQL assets he wants to push this to and any rules you want. And then if he has to add somebody else, he goes into Purview, adds it, pushes it to SQL, it's applied automatically. This is what we would call a central system for governance and access rights. So that's a little bit look at Purview. Andreas has great sessions this week at PASS. You can view more about this functionality and a lot of separate slides he can show you about. But he's told me he's very excited to talk to the SQL Server community itself as well with SQL Server 2022 and get your feedback as we build this more into the product. Okay, so we've talked about disaster recovery, Synapse Analytics, Purview for governance. Let's talk about the last two pieces of security, which is Azure Active Directory and Defender. So what's the challenge? You today have authentication schemes for SQL Server that involve SQL authentication or integrated security with Windows domain authentication. Now in the Azure SQL space, you have this option called Azure Active Directory Authentication, which a lot of people like. Wouldn't it be nice if SQL Server could do the same thing? And you see here in this diagram here, I have two scenarios where it might be helpful to you. One is a SQL Server 2022 on premises, and one is SQL Server 2022 in Azure Virtual Machine. Now, why is that important? Well, number one, it's a central authentication authority. A lot of customers are trying to move more to that centralized ability to control things in one spot. Why is that? Because it's a lot easier to maintain. And it gives you a new security authentication mechanism other than SQL auth without the requirements of a domain. Azure RBAC now is part of this. So you're going to use Azure Active Directory to Azure RBAC policies to set up all of this stuff, and then you can control it with SQL Server. And one of the things customers love with Azure SQL is it supports multi-factor authentication. Now you can have your users connect into a SQL Server on premises and have multi-factor authentication set up for their security rights to get authenticated to SQL Server. And then I just showed you the Purview policies concept. We need this to enable that functionality because Azure Active Directory is the way that we use the centralized system for setting up Purview. And then it's our intention to use things like Arc agents. Remember the Azure Arc, the SQL Server and Azure Arc enabled servers? We can use things like Arc agents to kind of make all of this possible to connect you to the cloud. So that's Azure Active Directory for SQL Server, being going to be part of SQL Server 2022. What about Microsoft Defender? Many customers today are looking at how to secure their SQL servers in not just a new and innovative way, but without having to create a lot of IP on their own. Like I want to take advantage of things that are known in the industry for industry common standards. And I'd like to be more proactive to look at things like threat protection. So I need a continuous assessment and alerts for security problems. But wouldn't it be nice if Microsoft could use some of their knowledge that they see to the community and industry to make that possible? So if you've not seen this technology before, it used to be called Azure Defender, rebranded last week Ignite to be called Microsoft Defender. And there's a Microsoft Defender for the cloud, and Microsoft Defender for SQL is part of that. And really it comes into two flavors when it comes to SQL. One is called vulnerability assessments. We'll scan your SQL assets based on a known frequency to look for potential vulnerabilities that are based on configuration of your SQL. And it's based on industry standards. Things like FedRAMP and CISS are known standards that we look at, and we refresh the rules based on those standards so that in some cases, when we scan again your system, we have updated rules on your system to keep it fresh and based on current standards. The thing is, there are baselines here. One thing I love about this system is we may look at FedRAMP, for example, or CIS, we may apply 20 rules to your SQL Server, and you may say, you know what, for these 3, I don't really want you to tell me anymore about those. I'm good, based on my own compliance and needs. So you can say, create that as a baseline, and we will not flag that again. But of course, if you wanted to light it up, you could go back and say, oh, that's part of your baseline. Now it can be something that we'll scan and detect you for. The other thing I like about this is that you don't just see things that show up as problems, you see everything that passed. So you can see all the vulnerability assessments we do, in case you're wondering behind the scenes, what is all the stuff we're checking for your SQL Server? The other thing is, for an advanced threat protection, you may want to be informed of or alerted to possible attacks against your SQL Server, like SQL injection queries or brute force attacks where people are trying to connect in and maybe hack into a password or a log that you've got set up, or even suspicious activity, people connecting in from unknown location around the world that normally don't connect in to your SQL Server. You'd like to get alerted about that too, perhaps, for example, through like email or texting. So let's take a second and stop and see what that looks like. And what I've chosen to do in this case, let me go back here, is I've chosen to use an Azure virtual machine that I've set up. Oh, and my session's expired. Isn't that beautiful? The one faux pas for the day. Let's see if it actually will come back for me here. So if not, I'll have to go back in the portal. Actually, you know what? Let's go back. I bet it picks it up. So what I've got is I've got the VM that I did for, do you remember my demo I did yesterday for parameter sensitive plan optimization? I did that in an Azure virtual machine installing SQL Server 2022 CTP builds. So I'm going to go here in my dashboard. Let me see if I can bring this back up again. Resource groups. Yeah, let's go here. Recent resources. Let's go to dashboard, home actually. Here it is right here, SQL virtual machine. Here it is. So one thing you didn't know that we didn't talk about in these sessions, but I talked about at Migration Precon, is that if you register your virtual machine in Azure as a SQL machine, you get some extra stuff. One of those is Microsoft Defender for the cloud. So this is literally a SQL Server 2022 instance. And I'm like, I wonder what it's going to show me. So up here are recommendations and alerts and findings. Let's talk about recommendations first. If I see here, SQL Server on machine should have vulnerability findings resolved, I get a detailed look of this vulnerability assessment concept. And what I love about this is that this is applying this across not just databases, but across multiple instances. I had a SQL Server 19 on this same VM. I put a named instance of a SQL 2022 instance, and it's telling me, hey, Bob, there's 17 out of 57 failed checks for master. You better go look at it, right? So you could click on a database. It's going to drill into just master. And now I can do a couple things. I can see things that should be flagged. Notice the benchmarks here that you see. And I just want to make sure I point this out to you. This is going to be the experience for your SQL Server. You're going to tie your SQL Server 2022 to this and use the portal if you'd like to go in and see this or be alerted as well, just like if you're running in Azure. Now, these are things like, look at here. SA login should be disabled. I didn't do that actually in this instance. I should, right? That's a very good common best practice. I should actually fix that. Now, how do we know that? If you click in here and look at the rule, this is what I love about it. Here is setting it up as a baseline, which I will not do, but I'm showing you the query we're using. So this functionality is looking actually at your SQL Server and running a query to determine how the rule should be applied. So you go back here and look at master again. One thing I wanted to show you was the past rules. Remember I said that you can see all the rules? And it showed you that there were like 17 of 57. Here are the ones that have passed. So if you're like, I'd like to know things that you checked that are already deemed okay, I might look at this as a best practice now to decide, should I apply that to all my other databases? The other thing I told you about was advanced threat protection or looking at alerts. Notice here, I have created and simulated a scenario, what I call a SQL injection. Now, what is that? And why did it alert me? Well, it turns out for this particular SQL Server, somebody has gone and run, in fact, let's go do this, full details here. Let's go look at what this has said. Somebody has run a query against my SQL Server that we've detected that actually could be what's called SQL injection, and you can see it right here. This is using kind of like string manipulation. Imagine you had a web application or an app where the developers did not properly check strings that are being filled in, and they build a dynamic SQL query based on things people have filled in and didn't do a lot of checking in that front end. Somebody actually sometimes can go through that process and try to do what's called SQL injection on your SQL Server. We can detect those anomalies, find them, and tell you about them. We can tell you where it came from, what IP it came from, We can even give you an alerting on this from an email perspective or even text perspective, so you will see it immediately and then go take potential action. So this is what the experience is going to feel like for you when you get SQL Server 2022 connected to the cloud with Microsoft Defender. Okay, let's go back here to the presentation. Now, let's finish. We've been here about an hour. We've talked about disaster recovery. We've talked about all the different things about Synapse Analytics. We've talked about Purview, Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, and even Defender. But just as we talked about yesterday, you're like, I want to get my hands on this stuff. How do I do it? We are in private preview right now. So if you wanted to get access, we have a limited private preview. This is the link where you're going to go sign up to get access to it. And one important thing to tell you about this is that we certainly want you to sign up and work with us, but we really intend this private preview program for you that are willing to work directly with us and give us feedback. It's one thing to download the bits and just kind of not look at it for a month or so. We're really looking for somebody to be more active with us. And it's a very important process for us to get feedback right now for things that we've announced. Kendall Van Dyke, who's a program manager on our team, is doing an amazing job to set up a private Teams channel and a GitHub repo for those customers that sign up for the program, so you can interact with us in a very direct way. Some of the people answering your questions right now are the ones you're going to interact with when you sign up for the program. Now, it is SQL Server 2022, so everybody has asked me, like in previous years, when will this release? Well, we're not going to miss the name. So all I can tell you right now is that public preview and general availability will be sometime next year in calendar year 2022. Really can't say more about that because we're going to go through a preview program to get to those points. But it is our intention not to miss the name. Joe Sack and I probably be out of a job if that happens. I really appreciate your time today. Let's review what we talked about, though, to make sure you know what's happening. We talked about the evolution of hybrid. Remember, for me, Bob Ward, hybrid is consistent products, both in the cloud and on premises. We think SQL provides you that. But really, when I'm talking about hybrid data platform today is connecting a SQL server to the cloud. And before, we had some very simple scenarios to support that with like backups, replication, those kind of things. We think we're stepping up the game. We're providing a managed disaster recovery site with Azure SQL Managed Instance. We're going to give you near real-time analytics using the power of SQL pools in Synapse, taking change feeds from a SQL server. We're going to actually be able to push and centrally governize policy manager across many SQL Server assets you have using Purview. We're going to allow you now to authenticate with Azure Active Directory, giving you things like multi-factor authentication. And we're going to actually we're going to give you the ability to set up vulnerability assessments and proactive alerts to keep your SQL Server 2022 more secure. And then finally, if you want to make sure you know where to get more information, if you didn't see this yesterday, I'm going to leave this screen up as we end today's session. If you want to go to the main website and keep up to date with everything we're doing in the product, we'll continue to keep this up to date as we go through the preview program. You can learn here at aki.ms SQL Server 2022. Again, here is the link, the second for the sign-up program, for the EIP sign-up. And then if you didn't see this or not, the Microsoft mechanics team are like the coolest people, the coolest producers in the world. I worked with them to produce a video that shows demonstrations of some of the things you saw today and some other things. And there's a lot of really cool animations they put in there. It's a story. Mechanics people know how to tell a story. And so look at this link right here to see the mechanics video on SQL Server 2022. I say that's a great way to share with your colleagues what is this message really all about. Now, if you didn't notice or not, we do things like webinars. Feels like a webinar, right? But we do these things called webinars online that are very popular. A lot of people like to see them. You may have colleagues that couldn't see this today, and they would like to go to maybe a condensed version of what we've talked about for SQL Server 2022. Next week, we have a webinar that you can now watch, and you're going to get live Q&A from all the members of the SQL team, like all the engineering folks that are behind the scenes are going to be online answering your questions. Myself, Matthew Burrows from our marketing organization, and Anna Hoffman, my colleague, will all be part of that webinar. And then I'm not sure you heard of this thing called Data Exposed. Anna Hoffman, like super rock stars, like a TV channel. Next week at the SQL Live conference, we are doing a live episode of Data Exposed. We're going to bring on engineering team members to have them demonstrate some of the things you've seen yesterday, today, and you'll see tomorrow. Don't forget tomorrow for two things. Number one, we have our Ask Me Anything panel with the SQL Everywhere team. I even forgot how many people have signed up for this, but it's all the rock stars behind the scenes that would love to talk to you online live with your questions. I'm going to host it, which I love because I don't have to answer the questions. I just give them the questions. Number two, David Pless, our great colleague, is going to do a deep dive on SQL Server 2022 storage and capabilities. So maybe you want to learn more about XML compression or SQL Ledger or multi-write replication. Dave's a session for you to see that tomorrow at the conference. You know, once again, I want to just thank all my moderators that have been online. Danny, Joe, Monet, thank you for answering all those great questions. Thank you, Grant, for being the moderator to help me run this session today here at the PASS Summit. And once again, thank you, Redgate. Thank you, all our sponsors, but thank you most the data community. Many of you know me. I've spoken at this event for 20-something years. I'm a big believer in the data community. I'm just so excited we've kept the momentum going on this. I hope that for the rest of the day today and tomorrow, you have a great time watching more content, looking at the on-demand content, and just learning more about Microsoft data products and especially SQL Server 2022. So thank you again for tuning in today, and we'll see you later. Have a great day.